So today we get to have continue our fun journey this February around love and liberation. And so as I said last week, we're talking about the season of love, right? Valentine's Day was last week. Also in February, we have the season of nonviolence, which is really talking about how we as a community, as a world, as individuals, can continue to embody the principles that Gandhi and Reverend Dr. King shared with us through their time here. And it's also Black History Month. It's an opportunity for us to understand freedom and to understand the civil rights movement and to understand the idea of freedom from a new perspective. Last week I talked to you all about true love. And a lot of what we were talking about was how the love that we understand in our culture, the love that we have been inculcated with as love, is ultimately not true love. A lot of our journey is about surfacing the toxic ways in which we've been taught to love, all these things that are roaming around in our subconscious, our preconscious, that is prohibiting us from truly being the presence of love. And that's on YouTube, that's also on Facebook, you can check that out. So today, we're gonna be moving on. We'll talk a little bit about individual, but it's really more about the collective love that we'll be talking about today and how we can be born again in love. No, it's not like the Southern Baptist revival here, you all. Don't get scared. So I'm going to start today with Dr. Martin Luther King, because I think it's quite apropos that we start there. And when I was a little girl growing up on the south side of Chicago, I loved February, because February was a time that we got to do all sorts of plays and oratory contests and all sorts of things, songs. And it was a time for me as a little chubby Mexican girl to be able to experience African American community, culture, and love. And so it holds a really special place in my heart, and particularly all the learnings around Dr. King. You know, he is thought about as our contemporary prophet of love. In January, he would have been 93 had he not been assassinated. And in fact, if we really think about it, it's been 54 years since he was assassinated. But his words still ring so true and so clear. And many of the things that we think we know about Reverend Dr. King, we actually don't know. Because his image and even his philosophy, quite frankly, have been sanitized through the years to kind of make this beautiful part of a story that is a feel-good story for us as a culture. And whereas that is true, there's also so much more to Dr. King's message that oftentimes is left out of the story. He talked about love as love in action, not just loving someone, not just having this kumbaya, rainbows and butterflies, I love you, you love me kind of situation. He talked about it from a place of what does your love speak into? What is your love saying? How are you moving love in this world? He talked about love as a strategy for change. So it's not about just this notion of the feel-goodness, because love, we learn from him, is not devoid of change. It is not devoid of challenge. It is really part of the love process. And one thing that he says, it's not enough for us to change the way we love. It's not just about the way love changes us. It's about how love changes structures, literally, by the way that we open our heart to love. So love for him was an action agenda. You know, he started off doing a lot of work, obviously, in the South around segregation, but later in his career, he moved to the North. In fact, he came to my hometown, Chicago, and did many organizing marches and activities around all the redlining that was happening there, as well as all of the housing discrimination. It's really sad and yet interesting at the same time that he was said to say that the people in the South could learn how to be more discriminatory from the people in Chicago. So that meant that we have this conception of the Southerners are backwards and the Northerners were more progressive. And in his own words, he said he had not experienced the hatred that he had to the level, deepness that he experienced in Chicago. That's something that we as a city are still carrying in our legacy, whether we want to admit it or not. He called for, in his career, as he moved on, he called for a more expansive and inclusive agenda. So it wasn't just about African Americans, it wasn't just about the South, it was about so much more. He began to challenge larger power structures and practices. He wanted to look not just at race, but at income. What was the state of income inequality in this country? At the time of his assassination, he was planning the Poor People's March, which was said to be something that could have been more than even the March on Washington. And again, progression in his own way of being love. He became very outspoken about the Vietnam War. So all of this was his way of being love in action and tackling the economic and social questions, practices, issues of the day. You know, it was okay, and this is just me saying it, I think it was okay when King was dealing with localized struggles and issues. But when he moved that to a larger agenda, then he became problematic. Did you all know that the FBI called him at one point the most dangerous man in America? That's kind of a big statement to make for somebody who's professing love, right? He was called the most dangerous man in America. He was, at the time of his death, whether we realize it or not, extremely unpopular. You know, the March on Washington took place in August of 1963. He was actually given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And just 4 years later, in 1968, a Harris poll, so the year he died, in 1968, had him with a public disapproval rating of 75%. Those dang pollsters, surveys, they always get you, don't they? But imagine that. We see him now, we think of him now, we see the images, the speeches, all of the dedications, but we don't realize that what really was happening in the progression of his own thinking and being and expressing God, and how that became problematic. Being love in action can be unpopular. Jesus, need I say more? That was Jesus's mission, right? To be love in action, which ended up being, from what we're told in the Bible, crucifixion, death as well. Crucified for promoting an ethic and a gospel of love, for asking people of his time and now asking us as we continue in this process of being love beyond current understanding. Jesus tells us how to begin this new process of understanding, but do we have the ears to listen? Verily I tell you, those with ears to hear and eyes to see, let them hear and see. So today we open ourselves up to moving into this idea of what is that process of understanding? How do we begin this opening, this new perspective? I want to start here, jump in with the Bible. I'm going to do here, open up to the Gospel of John. We're at chapter 3, pretty much verses 11 and 10, though all of chapter 3 is the discussion that Jesus has with Nicodemus. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. So he was a person that was in political and social power. He was somebody, he was a biggie, right? So he's coming to Jesus at night to ask him questions. He's curious about him. Maybe he's like a closeted fan, right? You know? He doesn't want to come out and say, something about you is resonating with me. But he comes to him in the night and he's asking him some questions. Now again, let's socially context this, historically context this. We're talking about a time when Jesus, as a Jew, was in a state of repression, meaning that it was Roman occupation, and so there was a lot happening politically in that time for people. And part of what he was trying to do was get people who were deeply entrenched in a mentality of just doing, going through what you knew, going through what you were told, going through what your parents told you to do and be. He was trying to get people to free their minds to think. And so we come into this story with all of that here, he's trying to challenge people to not be so satisfied with their interpretation or understanding of love, of life, of what was happening around them. So here we go. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. He came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do the signs that you do apart from the presence of God." Jesus answered him, "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above." Nicodemus said to him, "How can anyone be born after growing old? Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born?" Really, Nicodemus? Jesus answered, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. What is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the spirit is spirit. Do not be astonished that I said to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." Nicodemus said to him, "How can these things be?" And Jesus answered him, "Are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things?" What's going on there? We're going to do what we do here in Unity. We're going to look at this from a metaphysical standpoint. What is happening in the story beyond the words? The first thing that Charles Fillmore tells us, our co-founder of Unity, looking at the meaning, the metaphysics, the more than the physical, what are the words even themselves, giving us clues as to what the truth behind is. Nicodemus as a name means overcoming of the people, or victory of the people, or victor of the people, or victorious among the people. His name also means innocent blood, pure blood, or blood without blemish. Hold that thought. To Nicodemus, Jesus emphasized the need to be new. So it's not about the birth, it's about spiritual birth. Charles Fillmore would say we are born twice. We are born once of the flesh. We are born once of our mother's womb. And the second time, we are born from the will and the uniting of ourselves with spirit. That is the spiritual birth that we all have the opportunity and the necessity, I will say, to take place. Now, Nicodemus is pictured as a prominent Pharisee, one who believes in the strict letter of the scripture. Right? It's the words. This is what we're doing. This is the law. This is how it is. And yet he's open to conviction of a higher truth. He wants to kind of know. He's curious. There's something inside him is stirring and saying, there's more to this, I feel, but what is it and why? So we have that Pharisee side of him, of man's mind, that is now becoming aware and ready to hear. He becomes awakened to the presence of divine power. Now, the ruling tendency, right, of religion, generally speaking, and even at that time, is about being the surface, on the surface, what is said. And so Jesus is going beyond this. It's interesting that Nicodemus comes to him at night, because a representation of that is that he's coming in spiritual darkness. He's coming in a way wanting to see the light, wanting to understand more. So he's represented here as coming to Jesus as the spiritual I am, the pure blood, wanting to be open and receptive, the pure mind, the pure heart to understand. You following me so far? We following? Yes. We're going to keep going here a little bit. Now he says, born above. How do we interpret that? What is born of above? If we look at what he's trying to tell him, he's saying we need to go above that bird's eye view to see the landscape. If we're in our little domain, we don't see. How many times have you all been stuck in a situation in life where you've been so tied to what you think is true, you can't see, what do they say, the birds from the trees? You have to get that higher view. So he's saying, ascend to the higher view so you can see, so you can have a new and open perspective to learn what I'm trying to tell you, to learn what the truth is of your essence and of everyone's essence and what we're doing here as people on earth. So he's saying ascend. That is go from above. No one can really truly understand and embody spirit unless they make that ascension. The other clue he tells us is they're born out of water and spirit. What is water when you think about water in your own life? You wash your hands, it's cleansing. So the water, the idea is that we must cleanse, we must purify. The things that we carry in our mind, in our bodies, in our soul must be freed, must be cleansed. All of the things that have happened in and around us, there must be a process and a respect for what has happened and a way to move it through and move it on. It's kind of like what I talked about last week about letting go of the ways that we have learned to love. So the cleansing is about that. Born of water is to be cleansed of impurity, Charles Fillmore says. To be cleansed of impurity, sin, and the materiality through denial. To be born of spirit is to come into the consciousness of divine law and to lift the whole man into a new harmony of life and order. He talks about the wind and spirit. So spirit, like the wind, we can hear, but we can't see. So he's saying the cleansing has to take place, and we do that as well by listening, going deeper within and listening to what Spirit is saying. We don't realize, I'm not talking about like the Yul Brynner, this is God speaking, hello, hello, It's not that. We all have the ability to hear the voice, but it may not even be a voice. Sometimes those of us can see colors or sounds, or you'll hear a song. I get a lot of my messages through music, hip-hop music, actually. So there's different ways that we connect to be able to hear that wind, hear that spirit, though we don't see it. So he's talking about that. How do we do that? How do we create that? So we have some clues now. So I'm going to move a little deeper. I'm going to go into Martin Luther King talking about this passage. In one of his sermons called Where Do We Go From Here in 1967, he raises this conversation in the Bible between Jesus and Nicodemus. And here's what he says. One night, a juror came to Jesus and he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down in the kind of isolated approach of what he shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now Nicodemus, stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must stop drinking liquor if you are doing that excessively. He said something different altogether. So instead of just getting bogged down in one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. He said, in other words, your whole structure must change. All of these problems, he's talking about the U.S., all of these problems, personal and social, are tied together. What I am saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again. 1967. King chooses this passage to make clear the kind of love in action he's talking about. It's a love that is about making that alignment personally, but it's a love that's also about making the alignment structurally. He's talking about the change that is required in this country as well as in our minds and in ourselves. King reminds us that Jesus tells Nicodemus that he must die to his old self and be born new into an entirely new way of being. Other point he reminds us here, that all of these problems, we think of all of these things happening in the world, happening in Nashville, and we think of them as these disparate issues, these disparate problems, these things that are not connected. And he says, all of these problems are tied together. We are all tied together. We are all one. It is all oneness. So how are they not interrelated? If we believe the truth principles, as we say we do, we have to at least allow for that. We are tied together. There is no separation. We are one mind. The collective consciousness, all the collective things that happen and the personal move together. They are not separate. And so being love in action, he's telling us, requires a new perspective to be able to even begin seeing where we go from here. Here from above, the larger view, the beyond what we think we know. The question I ask everyone here today is, where do we go from here? How do we repair divisiveness? How do we repair racial and ethnic tensions and the historical pain that still is with us? We like to think that it's gone, and sometimes people get uncomfortable when we talk about certain things, and that's totally understandable. But things like the fact that where we are right now, Unity of Nashville, Brentwood, Oak Hill, this was all plantation at one time. I'll let you download what that means. This was land that was Native American at one time, that was given land grants to other people, and they were forcibly removed from their land. Why do I tell you this? Not to feel guilty, not to, pick up arms or anything like that. I say this to have us understand that all of this is connected. We believe in this connectivity of principle, but we have to also spin that out to understand that all of that happened back there, all of these walls, if they could talk, all of the pain that may even be in this sanctuary, all of that needs to be healed. This is how we become love in action, to have the courage to say, I'm willing to have that conversation. I'm willing to let down my guard. I'm willing to let go my ego. I'm willing to open up to maybe I'm not right. I don't have to be right, but you don't have to be right either. Nobody's right or wrong. All of this is for us to understand that there are these elephants in the room in our subconscious that need to come to light. This is what Jesus is telling us in terms of moving from above, healing, cleansing, and being able to hear, listen. Why dwell on that old pain, someone says? How do we understand unity if we are talking about difference? I always get that. And I always say it's through understanding our difference that we can appreciate our unity. It's through understanding the struggles of people that came before us. I've had conversations since I've been here with people, and I've heard from some folks of color that are in this congregation, and I am not surprised but yet astounded at the stories that I've been told about the level of discrimination, segregation, and frankly, hatred that has happened here. And I'm talking about the 80s and 90s. I have heard personal stories from people in this congregation, people who have talked about what it was like to be here. And guess what? What it was like to have those doors open, because this congregation was the only place they felt safe, and not just safe, welcomed. Yes. So we don't have to feel bad about things. This is where we get tripped up. We think we have to feel bad about what's happening. It's not. This congregation has been a legacy of openness, but yet we have some work to do. We have some explorations to make. We have some openness and some wounds to heal. And that's all wonderful and glorious. Wonderful and glorious opportunities that we have here to begin to really take love and light and principle to the next level. Does anybody hear me on that here today? Does that resonate for people here today? This congregation, each and every one of you are poised to be that person, to take it to the next level, because I think that we are ready. We have been ready. This congregation and everyone who has come before us has made us ready to do this. And I truly believe with every fiber of my being, with everything I am, that it's this congregation, it's this city, and it is now. So I ask, who's ready? I'm not going to do a meditation today, but during the song, I'll offer you all that as the time to sort of just meditate on the words of the song that will be shared with you in a moment. So I'm just going to close and just say that we're community building here. That's ultimately what all of what I'm talking about and what love in action means. Getting the new perspective from above, cleansing, purifying, healing, that's the water. Listening, that's the spirit. Having those difficult conversations and remembering that we are not here to change minds. We are here to open hearts. Let me say that again. We are not here to change minds. We are here to open hearts. And when that heart opens, hey, we don't know what's going to happen. It's not our business. Minds might be changed, but it's not for us to care, really, at some level. So born again in love, we must be born as Americans again in love. We must be born as Christians again in love. We must be born as Unity of Nashville again in love. And so I ask you that if you are ready to lift up your voice here today, stand if you are called to stand and say, I'm ready to be born again. Anybody ready? Who is ready to be born again? Together, I am ready to be born again. And so it is, and so we let it be. Amen. We can take that into our time of meditation. You may be seated.